She attended her sister's coronation, never knowing the Alpha King would choose her. Elara had always moved like a shadow in her sister's light. The grand halls of the royal palace seemed too vast, too echoing for her delicate presence. Her sister, Queen Lyanna, glided through the corridors as though the very walls bent to her will. Today, however, the halls were heavier than usual, with gold and velvet, with the scent of roses and incense curling through the air like smoke from a sacred flame. Today was the coronation, and Elara could not escape the feeling that fate itself lingered in the flickering torches. She wore a gown of deep midnight blue, stitched with silver threads that caught the light like threads of starlight. It was elegant, understated, a contrast to her sister's fiery red gown that shimmered with embroidered flames of gold. Elara felt her heart tighten. Even in this moment of grandeur, even beneath the watchful eyes of the kingdom, she felt invisible. The crowd of nobles whispered as they gathered around the throne, their voices a river of curiosity and judgment. Elara stood at the edge, her hands folded, her eyes scanning the court. Servants hurried past, carrying trays of wine, and musicians tuned strings that would play melodies of power and legacy. She could see her sister bowing before the high priest, her crown gleaming like sunlight, a symbol of authority that Elara had always known she would never wield. Yet amidst the ceremony and the chatter of the court, there was a presence that made Elara's breath catch. A hush fell when he entered. The Alpha King Chaol. He moved like a force of nature, each step measured, each gaze sharp enough to cut through the most carefully constructed masks. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell like a storm across his forehead, and eyes that held a strange mixture of fire and shadow. Whispers swept through the nobles, tales of his strength, his cunning, and the legend that he bore a curse older than the mountains themselves. Elara's pulse quickened, despite herself. She was not supposed to notice him, to be swayed by his presence, yet something in the way he surveyed the hall made her feel as though he saw her. Not just the gown, not just the posture, but the quiet pulse of her soul. The coronation progressed. Lyanna knelt before the high priest, her voice steady as he placed the crown upon her head. A murmur of admiration and envy rose among the courtiers. Elara felt a small pang, a familiar ache of being the shadow. But even as her sister rose, radiant and untouchable, Elara's gaze drifted to Chaol, standing at the edge of the hall, silent yet impossibly commanding. Then, as if drawn by a force she could not resist, Chaol's eyes met hers. A flicker of recognition passed across his face, almost imperceptible, yet enough to unsettle her. He moved forward, through the crowd with a grace that belied the weight of his presence. The murmurs fell silent as he approached, and even Lyanna, for a fleeting second, seemed aware of a tension that had shifted in the air. "Elara," Chaol said, his voice low, resonant, like the distant roll of thunder before a storm. "You have a fire in you, hidden beneath quiet waters." Elara's throat went dry. She had expected to be invisible, overlooked, yet here he was, speaking to her directly. Every instinct screamed caution. She did not know him, yet a strange familiarity tugged at her chest. "I thank you, Your Majesty," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I am honored to witness the coronation." Chaol's lips curved, almost imperceptibly in a shadow of a smile. "Witness, yes, but sometimes one's fate is not merely to witness." The words sent a shiver down her spine. She looked away, pretending to admire the intricacies of the throne, but her mind raced. What could he mean? Fate? Did the Alpha King, feared by all, untouchable, speak to her because she was noticed, or because she had been chosen? The coronation continued, though the rhythm of the ceremony now felt distant to Elara. Every movement, every word, seemed like a background to the sudden awareness that Chaol was observing her, not as one observes a guest, but as one observes something rare, something precious and dangerous. After the final blessing, Lyanna's court erupted into applause. Elara stood at the side, clapping politely, her mind tangled in the weight of Chaol's gaze. And then, as the nobles began to disperse for the feast, he stepped closer. His presence was overpowering, yet not with force. It was the quiet power of inevitability. "You are not what I expected," Chaol said, his tone carrying the weight of a challenge and a question. "Yet you are exactly what I seek." Ilara's breath caught. The court bustled around them, voices rising, but for a heartbeat it was as though the hall had shrunk to the space between them. She wanted to speak, to ask what he meant, but the words caught in her throat. "Your Majesty," she began cautiously. He raised a hand, gentle but commanding, stopping her mid-word. "Do not speak yet. Let me see." "Let me understand the quiet strength you carry." A tension settled between them, a magnetic force that pulled at something buried deep within her. She felt exposed, yet seen in a way that no one had ever truly seen her. And for the first time she wondered if her life, the life she had resigned herself to living in her sister's shadow, was about to change in ways she could not imagine. The feast began in the grand hall, tables laden with golden platters, roasted meats, fruits glistening like jewels, and crystal glasses catching the candlelight. Nobles and courtiers laughed, discussed alliances, and whispered secrets, but Ilara felt detached from it all. Her attention kept returning to Kale, who moved among the tables like a shadow, speaking to lords and ladies with a charisma that demanded obedience. At one point, Kale paused at her table. The crowd seemed to part for him, though no one touched him. "You dine alone?" he asked, his gaze flicking over her face as if searching for a flaw, a weakness, or perhaps an unspoken truth. I prefer quiet," she replied, her fingers brushing the rim of her glass. "It allows one to observe more clearly." He nodded slowly as though her words confirmed something he had suspected. Observing is wise, but one must also act, or fate slips like water through your hands. Ilara felt a strange mixture of fear and thrill. Every word he spoke seemed layered with meaning, every glance like a challenge. The heat of his presence was unlike any she had ever known, yet there was a restraint, a control, that made it almost unbearable. As the night deepened, the ceremony concluded, and the halls began to empty. Courtiers retired to their chambers. Nobles whispered in shadowed corners, and the music softened to a haunting melody that lingered like a memory. Ilara lingered near a window, gazing at the moonlight spilling across the palace gardens. When Kale appeared beside her, "You feel it too, do you not?" he asked quietly, his voice low, almost intimate. "The pull of something beyond what the eye can see?" Ilara turned to him, her heart pounding. I do not know what you mean." He looked at her with an intensity that made her feel as if he were looking through the layers of her soul. "You will in time. The world we live in, it has currents, deep currents that sweep the unsuspecting into tides they cannot resist. Tonight, you are part of that current." She swallowed hard, a thousand thoughts and fears swirling within her. "And if I am swept away," Kale's eyes softened for only a fraction of a second, "then you will learn who you truly are, and perhaps who I am as well." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of unspoken promises, untested fate, and the tremor of beginnings. Ilara felt something within her awaken, something fierce, fragile, and unyielding all at once. She did not know what lay ahead, but she sensed that her life as she had known it had ended the moment Kale's gaze fell upon her. And then, as if drawn by instinct, Kale stepped back, his shadow stretching long across the marble floor. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we begin the work that fate has chosen for us." Before she could ask what he meant, he was gone, swallowed by the corridors of the palace. The night seemed colder, the moonlight sharper. Ilara pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the rapid beat of her heart, and realized that something fundamental had shifted. She had attended her sister's coronation to witness a rise in power, a celebration of light and legacy. Instead, she had been seen by the Alpha King, the one figure in the kingdom whose will was absolute and chosen in a way she could not yet understand. The weight of it pressed against her like a shadow, and deep in the silence of the palace, she wondered if her life would ever belong to her again, or if she had already become a part of Kale's storm. The morning after the coronation, Ilara woke to a sky brushed with pale gold, the castle bathed in the quiet hum of a world already moving without her. She had slept little, her mind restless with Kale's gaze, his words, the strange weight of being chosen. She wondered what it meant, and whether she had any choice in the matter. Her room, usually a sanctuary of soft light and books, felt smaller now. Even the familiar scent of lavender from the window garden could not calm her. A knock on the door broke her thoughts. "Elara, it is for you," came the voice of a palace attendant. A folded note rested in the hands that extended toward her. She took it carefully, recognizing Kale's seal. A black emblem etched with silver, a symbol whispered in tales of power and danger. Her fingers trembled as she broke the wax. The message inside was simple yet commanding. "Come to the Moonstone Hall at dusk. Do not bring anyone. Your presence is required. Kale." No further explanation. No reason given, only a summons from the Alpha King himself. Elara felt the pull of destiny tighten around her chest. She could refuse, she told herself, yet a strange certainty whispered that refusal was not a choice. Her curiosity mingled with fear pushed her forward. The day stretched slowly, the palace bustling with preparations for a ceremonial feast. Courtiers whispered about the coronation, about Queen Liana, about Kale's presence, and his piercing gaze at Elara. Some noble women looked at her with envy, some with thinly veiled curiosity, but all seemed to sense that the ordinary rhythms of the day were now overshadowed by an extraordinary force. Elara wandered the corridors, avoiding the eyes of the servants, her thoughts circling endlessly. What did Kale want? Why had he singled her out, a quiet shadow in her sister's brilliance? She tried to recall any action, any word that might have drawn him to notice her, but the truth was, she had only existed quietly, as she always had. And yet, now she was to step into a world she did not understand. As dusk fell, the castle transformed. Torches were lit, casting flickering shadows along the stone walls. The Moonstone Hall was a place of legend, where the king met with those he trusted, where deals were made in silence, and where truths often came at the edge of danger. Elara's footsteps echoed in the empty corridors as she approached the hall. When she reached the massive doors, they opened almost as if expecting her. Inside, Kale stood waiting. He was no longer the commanding presence of yesterday's ceremony, but something quieter, more intense. Shadows clung to him, curling like smoke, but his eyes, dark as the deepest night, held a flicker of warmth, or perhaps curiosity.
"Elara," he said, his voice softer than before, yet still carrying the weight of authority. "You came." I
did, Your Majesty," she replied, bowing slightly. Her hands were clammy, though her mind struggled to remain steady. He studied her, walking slowly, deliberately, like a predator circling a new prey, though not with malice. "You have strength," he said, "but you hide it, as if you are afraid of your own shadow. That is what I see in you. That is why I chose you." Elara's heart skipped. Chosen. The word repeated itself in her mind. Chosen for what? She had expected attention from Kale to be fleeting, a passing curiosity, but the certainty in his tone told her otherwise. You chose me," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kale paused, placing a hand on the carved railing of the hall. "Yes. Not for your sister, not for the court, not for appearances. You carry something rare, a quiet fire that can withstand storms." Elara felt a surge of something strange, fear, awe, and an inexplicable connection. She had always been cautious, wary of being noticed. Yet here was a man whose gaze penetrated every carefully placed layer of her being. "Why me?" she asked finally, forcing herself to speak. "Why not someone stronger, wiser, more visible?" Kale's eyes darkened, and for a moment, the warmth vanished. The air in the hall seemed to grow heavier, because the world does not always choose the obvious. Sometimes it chooses those who can endure the hidden trials. And you are hidden. But that will change. The silence stretched between them. Elara wanted to question further, but she could feel the weight of his presence pressing upon her, a gravity that demanded respect. Kale turned away, his cloak brushing the floor, and motioned toward the vast windows overlooking the palace gardens. "Walk with me," he said. The gardens were bathed in moonlight, silver and cold. The air smelled of jasmine and frost. Shadows stretched across the paths, but Kale's presence made the darkness feel alive, almost sentient. "You speak of trials," Elara said cautiously. "What trials?" Kale did not answer immediately. Instead, he stopped at a fountain, the water catching the moonlight in dancing ripples. "There is a curse upon my lineage," he said finally. "One that has haunted my family for generations. Those who are chosen by the Alpha, they are bound by this curse, whether they know it or not." Alara's heart raced. She had expected danger, political games, even whispers of supernatural forces, but to hear it confirmed, to feel it brush against her like a cold wind, sent a chill down her spine. "What curse?" she asked, though the words seemed fragile in the night. Kale's eyes met hers again, intense and unwavering. "A curse that can destroy kingdoms, that tests loyalty, courage, and the heart itself. Those who are chosen, they either survive it and rise stronger, or they are consumed." The weight of his words pressed down on her. Chosen. Curse. Survival. She had always lived a careful life, watching her sister, hiding in shadows. But now the shadows themselves seemed to shift around her, as if the world had decided to place her in the center of a storm she did not yet understand. "And you," she whispered, "you chose me to face this?" Kale's gaze softened, the storm in his eyes giving way to a glimmer of something human. "I chose you because I do not fear what you may become." Many would tremble, falter, or flee. But I see, you might endure, you might rise. Elara felt a tremor of fear and something else, something dangerous and thrilling, a spark of possibility. She had always thought of herself as ordinary, a shadow of her sister. Now, in the quiet moonlight, she realized that perhaps she had been hiding strength even from herself. They walked in silence for a time, the fountain's waters murmuring like whispered secrets. Kale finally spoke, his tone lighter, almost teasing. "You must understand, Elara. Being chosen is not an honor, it is a challenge. One that will test every part of you." And yet, his lips curved slightly. "I think you are ready." Elara wanted to believe him, wanted to feel the courage he seemed to see in her. But doubt clung to her, thick as shadows. I do not know if I can." Kale looked at her, unwavering. "You do not know yet, but you will. And when you do, you may find that the strength you thought hidden is greater than you imagined." The moonlight deepened, and Elara knew she could not stay in the garden forever. She had to return to her room, to her sister, to the life she thought she knew. Yet she felt changed, pulled into a current that carried both danger and a strange allure. Before she left, Kale stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat of his presence without a word being spoken. "Rest tonight," he said quietly. "Tomorrow we begin the true work of the chosen. And remember, the world has a way of testing those who are ready, whether they wish it or not." Elara nodded, though her mind spun with questions she could not voice. She left the gardens, her steps echoing in the silent corridors, her heart racing with fear, curiosity, and a growing sense of inevitability. That evening, alone in her chamber, Elara stared at the letter Kale had sent. At the memory of his gaze, the cold silver of the fountain, the whisper of jasmine in the night. She wondered what awaited her tomorrow. She wondered what trials, what challenges, what hidden truths lay ahead. And she realized, with a mixture of dread and fascination, that she could no longer remain in the quiet shadow she had always occupied. Something had shifted, something irreversible. The Alpha King had chosen her, and the currents of fate, dark and powerful, had begun to sweep her forward. The morning sun poured through the tall windows of the moonstone hall, painting the polished stone floors with streaks of gold. Elara arrived early, as Kale had instructed, her hands still trembling with anticipation. She had slept little, her thoughts haunted by the weight of his words from the night before. The world has a way of testing those who are ready. She did not know what the test would be, or how she was to face it. All she knew was that Kale, the Alpha King of whispered legend, had chosen her, an ordinary woman, always careful, always unseen, to step into a world of shadows, power, and a curse older than the mountains. When she entered, Kale was already there. He stood by the high arch of the hall, his gaze fixed on the faint light spilling from the windows. Even in the morning he carried the presence of a storm, dark and commanding, yet there was a subtle shift in his posture, a vulnerability she had not seen before. "You are on time," he said without turning. His voice was smooth, calm, but there was an undercurrent of tension, like coiled steel. "I came as you asked," Elara replied softly. She felt the weight of the hall press upon her, the silence demanding attention. Kale turned slowly to face her. "Good," he said, his voice carrying a faint edge of relief. "The first trial is not physical, nor political. It is a test of understanding, of knowing the curse that binds my family, and of seeing the strength it will demand of you." Elara frowned, the word curse catching her breath again. The night had been filled with whispers of magic, danger, and destiny, but to confront it directly felt heavier than anything she had imagined. What must I do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. Kale's eyes softened slightly. "You must see, you must feel, and you must decide what you are willing to sacrifice for strength and survival." He extended a hand, and with it a small crystal orb glowed faintly in the morning light. Inside, shadows swirled like smoke, dark and alive. "Look into it," Kale instructed. "The curse shows itself differently to each chosen. You may see danger, or temptation, or a reflection of yourself." Elara hesitated, her heart pounding. But the pull of destiny and something inexplicable in Kale's gaze urged her forward. She reached out and touched the orb. The moment her fingers brushed the crystal, the hall seemed to dissolve around her. Shadows swirled and twisted, forming shapes of fire and storm, mountains and rivers, faces she did not recognize. A whisper, low and haunting, spoke directly to her mind. "Do you have the courage to stand when the world falls? Do you have the heart to face what you fear most?" Elara's pulse raced, and yet she did not step back. She thought of her sister, of the palace, of the ordinary life she had always clung to, and then she thought of Kale. The intensity in his gaze, the quiet fire he had seen in her, and the way he believed she could endure.
I will face it," she whispered, the words trembling but firm.
The shadows shifted. Now she saw herself, alone in a storm, surrounded by echoes of failure, whispers of doubt, the weight of expectation pressing on her from every side. Yet beneath the fear, there was a small light, pulsing steadily, a flame that did not extinguish. She felt a strange warmth, a quiet courage she had never recognized within herself. Kale's voice broke through, calm but resolute. "Do not let fear bind you. You are stronger than you think. You have always been stronger than you think." Elara blinked, and the vision changed. She saw Kale, standing amid fire and shadow, unyielding yet worn, a man carrying centuries of burden and a curse that had shaped his every choice. For the first time she understood. His strength was inseparable from the danger that haunted him, and she, chosen by him, was part of that same storm. When the vision finally faded, Elara found herself back in the hall, her hands gripping the orb tightly. She was trembling, but she also felt something else, a spark of understanding, a whisper of her own power. Kale approached, his eyes softer now, filled with an intensity that made her heart flutter. "You see now," he said quietly. "The curse is not just mine. It touches those I choose, those I trust, those I desire." Elara swallowed, her mind racing. Desire. The word lingered in the air, fragile and dangerous. She had been drawn to him from the first moment, yet now she felt the weight of responsibility, of choice, pressing down. "You chose me for this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Kale nodded, his gaze unwavering.
"Yes."
"But not because I expected you to fail, because I believe you can endure it." And perhaps because you are the only one who can help me face it as well. Elara's chest tightened. She had expected tests, challenges, maybe even danger, but never the complexity of emotions, never the storm of connection that Kale stirred in her heart. She realized that strength was not only about enduring trials. It was about confronting feelings that terrified her, acknowledging them without letting them consume her. The day stretched onward, and Kale guided her through the castle's secret chambers, halls that few had seen, filled with relics of his family, and traces of the curse that had haunted them for generations. Each artifact seemed to hum with power, each shadow carrying a story of sacrifice and consequence. "You must learn," Kale said, his voice low as they walked, "that power without understanding is destruction. And those who are chosen, they must know not only the strength of their enemies, but the strength of their own hearts." Elara nodded, absorbing the weight of his words. She felt the pull of destiny stronger with each step, the threads of the curse intertwining with her own fate. She also felt the growing intensity of Kale's presence beside her, not as a king distant and unreachable, but as a man whose trust, whose attention, was focused entirely on her. There were moments when their hands brushed accidentally, a touch that sent sparks through her, a fleeting warmth that lingered long after contact. She felt the tension between them, unspoken yet undeniable, and yet Kale never crossed the line, never forced her in any way. His power was overwhelming, yet restrained, and that restraint made the pull almost unbearable. "You feel it too, do you not?" Kale asked suddenly, stopping by a window overlooking the gardens. The moonlight was pale now, the last rays of day retreating behind distant hills. Elara looked at him, heart racing. "Feel what?" "The connection," he said simply. "The pull between us. The danger and the inevitability of it." She swallowed, words caught in her throat. She did feel it. The tension, the unspoken longing, the mixture of fear and fascination that he stirred within her. It was impossible to ignore. Yet she also felt cautious, aware that their fates were entangled by more than desire. They were bound by a curse, by prophecy, by something far older and more powerful than either of them. Kale's eyes softened, his usual intensity giving way to something almost fragile. "I do not often reveal this side of myself," he admitted quietly, "but with you I must. You are not like the others. You challenge me, and you awaken something I thought long buried." Elara's chest tightened. She had expected danger, intrigue, and challenge, but never the revelation of vulnerability in the Alpha King himself. And yet, seeing it, she felt something shift inside her. Perhaps she could face this curse, these trials, not only because Kale believed in her, but because she was beginning to believe in herself. Night fell and the palace was quiet again, save for the distant hum of the city beyond the walls. Elara returned to her chambers exhausted, yet unable to sleep. She sat by the window, staring at the moonlit gardens, replaying the day in her mind. She had faced a glimpse of the curse, seen Kale's vulnerability, felt the undeniable pull between them. She had also felt her own strength stirring, fragile but persistent, like a flame refusing to be extinguished. And she knew that the next steps would be even more dangerous, more demanding and more revealing, not only of the curse, but of the hearts involved. As she closed her eyes, she felt the weight of destiny pressing upon her. The Alpha King had chosen her. The curse had begun to touch her life. And the storm of emotion, of desire, and of danger was only beginning to sweep through her world. The sky was heavy with clouds, dark as iron, as if the heavens themselves waited for what was to come. Elara stood at the balcony of the Moonstone Hall, the wind tugging at her gown, and watched the palace gardens below twist in shadow. Kale had summoned her at dawn, and already the air hummed with tension, the quiet before a storm that promised both danger and revelation. She had trained, observed, and prepared under Kale's guidance. The visions of the curse, the whispered warnings, and the trials she had faced over the last days had shaped her into something stronger, fiercer, and more certain of herself. She was no longer the quiet shadow of her sister, no longer invisible. The world demanded she act, and she was ready. Or, as ready as anyone could be against forces older than the mountains. Cale appeared beside her, his presence solid and unwavering. The storm seemed to cling to him, darkness gathering in the clouds above, yet there was a light in his eyes, a flicker of hope, of trust, and unspoken of something deeper. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low, resonant. Elara turned to him, meeting his gaze without faltering. "I am," she said, though her heart pounded with anticipation. She had faced visions, tests, and whispers of the curse before, but today would be the true trial, the moment when both their fates would collide with the power that had haunted Cale's lineage for generations. Cale nodded, and together they stepped into the moonstone hall. The air inside was colder, charged with invisible currents that made the hairs on her arms stand. Shadows moved across the walls, as if alive, and Elara could feel the pulse of magic, old, dangerous, and demanding respect. "This is the heart of the curse," Cale said, his hand brushing against a carved pedestal that pulsed faintly with dark energy. "It is drawn to power, to fear, and to emotion. It tests all who are chosen. We must face it together." Elara swallowed, but she did not step back. She had come too far to falter now. She had endured fear, doubt, and tension, and had begun to understand the quiet fire within her, the strength Cale had seen from the beginning. Cale extended his hand. "Trust me," he said simply, "as I trust you." She took it, and together they approached the pedestal. The shadows on the floor thickened, coiling around them like living threads. A whispering voice rose from the darkness, carrying the weight of centuries. "Who dares defy the curse? Who dares to stand against fate itself?" Elara stepped forward, her hand gripping Cale's, her voice steady. "We do. We do together." The shadows roared, twisting, testing her courage. Images of failure, loss, and despair flashed before her eyes. She saw her sister falter, the kingdom crumble, and Cale himself succumb to darkness. Each vision struck at her heart, but she refused to turn away. She drew upon the strength she had discovered in the past days, the resilience that had been dormant within her all her life. "Focus," Cale said beside her, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You are stronger than the fear it presents. Believe in yourself. Believe in us." Alara's pulse raced. She felt the shadows pressing closer, the curse testing her, whispering her deepest fears, yet she held on, not just to Cale's hand, but to the certainty of her own courage. Slowly, she began to feel the threads of darkness weaken, bending under the strength of her resolve. Cale's eyes met hers, and in that moment she saw the weight he had carried for centuries. The loneliness, the burden of power, and the constant fear of failing those he loved. His strength was formidable, yet fragile beneath the surface. She realized, as if for the first time, that his choice of her had not been mere curiosity. It had been a need for trust, a need for someone who could face the darkness without faltering. Together, they stepped fully into the shadow. Elara lifted her head, her voice steady. "We are not afraid. We will endure. We will rise." The curse flared one last time, a storm of black and silver, twisting and turning around them. But rather than fear, Elara felt clarity. She drew upon her own courage, channeling it through her presence and into Cale, connecting them not just as allies but as two souls facing the weight of destiny together. The shadows recoiled, the darkness breaking apart like mist under sunlight. The hall fell silent, heavy with the absence of movement, and then the light of the morning sun pierced through the high windows, scattering the remaining shadows. The curse had not been destroyed. Ancient magic does not yield so easily. But it had been contained, weakened by the bond between the Alpha King and the one he had chosen. Cale exhaled, the tension in his body easing for the first time in centuries. He looked at Elara, and the intensity in his eyes softened, vulnerability giving way to something more human. "You have done more than endure," he said quietly. "You have risen." Elara felt a rush of relief, exhaustion, and triumph. She had faced the darkness, the curse, and the test of courage, and had survived. She looked at Cale, not as a shadow looming over her, but as a man who had carried burdens too heavy to bear alone, who had chosen her not for what she lacked, but for what she could offer in strength, courage, and heart. "You did not have to face it alone," she said softly. "You carried it for centuries. I only had to meet it with you." Cale stepped closer, their hands still entwined. "I feared no one could stand beside me. Yet you proved me wrong. And perhaps in doing so, you have changed me as well." Elara felt a shiver at the intensity of his words. She had feared danger, prophecy, and the unknown, but never the depth of feeling she sensed now. She realized that her journey had been more than survival. It had been transformation. She was no longer the shadow of her sister, no longer unseen or untested. She had found her strength, her voice, and the power to face a world that once seemed impossible to conquer. Cale studied her, and for a moment the weight of centuries seemed to lift from his shoulders. "You are more than I imagined," he admitted, almost whispering. "Stronger, wiser, and yet still so full of life." Elara smiled faintly, the exhaustion and adrenaline mixing with a warmth that settled deep in her chest. "And you are more than your legends, your curse, your crown. You are human, Cale, and even kings are allowed to be seen, to be understood, and to be cared for." The words lingered in the hall like a promise. The storm of fate had passed, but its echo remained. And in that echo there was a sense of hope, of renewal, of a future that could be shaped not by fear, but by courage, trust, and connection. The palace itself seemed to breathe with them, the once ominous shadows now retreating into corners, the light of day spreading warmth across the stone floors. The curse had been tempered, its power not erased, but balanced. And in the quiet aftermath, Elara felt a strange peace, a feeling that she had been waiting for her entire life. Later, in the quiet of the Moonstone Hall, Cale led Elara to the balcony. The city beyond shimmered in the sunlight, the gardens below vibrant with life, and the air carried the scent of flowers and earth. He stood beside her, his hand brushing hers gently, the unspoken connection between them stronger than words could capture. "You have changed everything," Cale said quietly. "Not just the curse, but the way I see the world, the way I see myself. You have given me something I thought I lost long ago." Elara turned to him, her eyes steady. "And you have shown me what courage truly is. You have shown me that strength is not in hiding from fear, but in facing it together." They stood in silence, the weight of their journey settling around them like a warm cloak. The palace, the curse, the storm of destiny, all had tested them, shaped them, and now left them standing at the edge of something new. "You will not be alone," Cale said finally, his voice resolute. "The path ahead will have shadows, as it always has. But together we will face them, and we will endure." Elara felt a sense of clarity she had never known. The trials, the tests, the visions, they had all led to this moment. She was no longer a passive witness to her life. She was chosen, yes, but not merely to serve. She was chosen to rise, to act, and to stand as Cale's equal, not in power alone, but in courage, heart, and will.
"I will face it," she said, her voice steady.
"Whatever comes, I will face it with you." Cale's eyes softened, and for the first time he allowed himself a small, genuine smile. The Alpha King, feared by all, burdened by centuries of curse and legend, stood beside the woman who had endured, who had risen, who had shown him the strength of human courage and connection. The sun rose fully over the horizon, painting the palace in light. The shadows lingered at the edges, reminders of the curse, the past, and the trials yet to come. But for the first time, they were no longer threatening. They were part of the balance, part of a world that could be met with courage, love, and hope. Elara looked at Cale, and Cale looked at her. Words were no longer necessary. The trials had been faced. The curse had been tempered. And in the quiet warmth of the morning, they both understood that they had found something rare and enduring. A bond forged in shadow, tested by fate, and strengthened by the courage of two hearts, standing together.